Joining us now in the studio is Ralph Hilman, the Executive Director of the Australian Coal Association. Also with us is Dr. Richard Denniss, the Executive Director of the Australia Institute. Thanks to both of you for being here. First to Ralph Hilman, do you believe in the science which says the planet is warming dangerously?
The coal industry accepts the science of climate change, Tony. We've accepted it for many years, and we've been investing in the development of low-emission coal technologies since at least about 2001. And as your program just showed, we have $1 billion fund we've put together over the next 10 years from a levy on Australian coal production. It's unique. No other industry anywhere in the world has done this. And we're working with the Commonwealth and state governments and with generators to have commercial-scale demonstration plants with carbon capture and storage in operation in Australia by 2015.
I'll come back to that in a moment, but you accept that burning coal is one of the biggest contributors to greenhouse gases and therefore one of the biggest contributors to global warming?
Yes, 34% of Australia's greenhouse gas emissions come from burning black and brown coal for the generation of electricity. Okay,
so you accept those facts, that burning coal is very serious, that global warming is very serious, and yet, without any proven carbon capture and storage technology anywhere in the world, you're planning to double coal exports to the rest of the world with no restrictions on that whatsoever. Is that correct?
We're putting in place in Australia the infrastructure to allow us to continue to increase our exports, but we're also investing in the technology that will allow coal in Australia and elsewhere to be burnt with a substantial reduction in its emissions of 80 to 90%. This technology isn't pie in the sky. It's all proven in the lab or in other parts of industry. What we need to do here in Australia and America and Europe is put together and integrate these technologies so we can put the coal in one end, burn it, capture the CO2, compress it, take it away and bury it. Each individual step has already been proven. Integrating them is the challenge, but it's not an insurmountable challenge. It's no more difficult than the challenges confronting solar thermal, confronting geothermal, and confronting biomass, the other alternatives. The CSIRO pointed out in evidence to the Senate just in April that all these technologies are on a similar time path. They're all heading in a similar cost direction. We won't know for 15 years where they're going to end up, but they are viable technologies.
They're viable technologies. Richard Denniss, do you agree with that?
Well, they might be viable, but if that's the case, nothing's changed since the Pemsec report in 2002, where exactly the same claims were put forward. All the pieces are in place. Any minute now we're going to put them all together. We're going to have the demonstration plants, which we never see. And then the big question is anyone going to be willing to pay for it? The argument that we can't afford to have renewable energy and we can't afford to pursue all these other things is in stark contrast to the fact that the cost of solving these problems, even if they can be solved, will make the technology prohibitively expensive.
Is there any suggestion that you know what the cost structure is going to be with this unproven technology?
As is the case for all these technologies, you can only make estimates. But it's envisaged that it'll cost about 30% more to generate coal incorporating carbon capture and storage than it does to generate it without it. But that's a rubbery figure. I think what Richard was talking about is where is the money going to come from to build these plants? Well, I think
what he's talking about was, are these plants even going to be economically viable
at the
end if you do manage to build them, and given that the promises that we'd actually see something concrete before now have already been made?
Well, I think the point that came out of your program earlier is that there is no choice. The International Energy Agency and other reputable agencies say that world energy demand is going to grow very, very rapidly, and that coal demand is going to grow by about 2% per annum out to 2030, driven by China and India. We have to find it, and there is no other solution. We have to have coal, but we also have to have renewables. We have to have the lot.
Richard Denniss, this is a key point, isn't it? I mean, the governments of the US, of Britain, of Canada, of Australia, Sir Nicholas Stern, James Wolfenson, the chairman of the IPCC, Rajendra Pachauri, all agree that carbon capture and storage is essential to reining in global carbon emissions. In fact, I don't think we've been able on this program to find a senior official in any country, particularly those countries named, who thinks otherwise. So isn't it a fact this has to work, and if it doesn't, what next?
Well, look, hope is not a strategy, and I hope that someone can invent clean coal. I hope that it's affordable. The issue is, how are we going to spend the next 10 or 15 years, not just in terms of research, but in investment? What are we going to start building tomorrow when the evidence suggests if we don't make serious emission reductions in the next 15 years, the capacity to keep our emissions within the carbon budget that delivers a stable climate is evaporating. It's slipping through our fingers as we speak. So to sit back and say, regardless of what the question is, the answer is clean coal, I think we're literally putting all our eggs in one basket.
How likely is it, though, given all of those very senior figures who've lined up on one side of the argument, that is, you must have clean coal technology, how likely is it there'll be any sort of international move to restrict the sale of coal or the mining of coal?
Well, look, what we need to do is solve the problem. The problem is, how many emissions do we want to have? We don't have to pick which technologies are going to work. What we need to say is Australia will not emit more than X, the world will not emit more than Y. And then I'm more than happy for the Coal Association or for BHP to go and risk their money going and investing in things that they think will rescue us from climate change. That's a great idea. It's what capitalism's all about. But the idea that we don't set targets that are ambitious enough to tackle climate change, and we don't start to invest in alternatives that we know will work until we've packaged up clean coal, is just, it's gambling with everybody's future.
Ralph Hilman, I mean, we keep getting incredibly disappointed by this potential technology that doesn't appear, and indeed the disappointment emerged again in the United States just over the last few days. A $1.5 billion clean coal plant, supposed clean coal plant to be built in Washington State, has just been cancelled because the people who are trying to build it have decided they simply can't do it. They can't capture and store carbon emissions in the foreseeable future. Now, this is in the United States, where the very large sums of money are being spent on this. So what gives you any optimism at all that 2015 date you're talking about will actually work?
We have the whole G8 behind it. There's a G8 commitment, there's a commitment from the Commonwealth Government, there's commitment from state governments, and there's commitment from industry. We're doing the work to design the projects, doing the feasibility and pre-feasibility studies. We're identifying the storage sites. Things are happening. We're building demonstration plants at smaller scale. We're running pilot plants. The CSIRO is running 2 post-combustion capture pilot plants in Australia and 1 in China. Things are happening. But the other point I'd like to take up that Richard's made is that it's not as if we're just spending all our efforts on low emissions coal and everything else is being ignored. The government is also putting enormous resources into renewables, and it has mandated a renewable energy target which is going to deliver a $50 billion subsidy to renewables over the next 10 years. Plus it's got $1.6 billion just announced for solar.
In fact, you've mentioned the amount the industry is spending, but it's been calculated that what you're putting in is actually 0.3% of your total revenue, whereas the government is actually picking up most of the burden. If the industry is so concerned about this, why doesn't it actually put more money itself into developing this new technology? Well,
the government's actually picking up about a third of the cost. It does it on the basis of a Commonwealth a third, the state a third, and industry a third. So our $1 billion is right up there. And just remember, it is not the coal industry that is emitting the CO2. It's the generating industry. They are the people who have to invest in the new technologies and in the new plants.
I know, but that does bring you to the point made by Guy Pearce in our story, that the coal industry is using the dope dealer's defence because it's exporting huge amounts of coal which are burnt in dirty coal-fired power stations, and saying it has no responsibility for that.
The coal that Australia exports is in fact mostly going to countries that will have pretty stiff targets under any new global climate change agreement. 44% goes to Japan. Now that's a serious Kyoto country. 12% to Korea, 12% to Taipei. Those are wealthy economies. They will all have targets under whatever new architecture emerges. Australian coal isn't going off into the never-never and being burnt in an uncontrolled way. That isn't going to happen.
Well, it is, in fact. But,
those countries will all introduce...
the controls haven't happened yet.
Carbon capture and storage.
Perhaps, if it works. Can we go to the whole question of how likely, well, I've mentioned this before, but international moves to sort of rein this in may or may not happen. But you're mostly concerned about whether or not the technology will actually have the holes in the ground where you can actually bury this stuff.
Well, that's right. I mean, there are so many problems that need to be tackled, and one of them is that we haven't invented it yet. The second is we don't know how much it will cost. And the third is that even if we invented it and could afford to build it, it's not obvious that we would be taking plants such as the ones in the Hunter Valley and be able to bury the gas there. The costs that we referred to before, the 30% increase in cost, that's just to generate clean coal. There's enormous costs associated in shipping enormous amounts of CO2, hundreds, possibly thousands of kilometres across Australia and pumping it under the ground. The costs are going to be enormous, and clean coal technology will disrupt jobs and regional economies just as much as investing in renewable energy, because the existing coal-fired power stations will have to be knocked down in the most likely scenarios, or they'll be so massively altered, and the gas will have to be taken somewhere quite different. That, you know, we talk about maintaining the status quo in Australia while we're simultaneously saying we're trying to urgently tackle climate change. If you want to leave everything exactly where it is, if you want Australia to look exactly the way it looks like it does, then you're not tackling climate change.
Ralph Hilman, let me put that to you, because I mean, we had Nicholas Stern on this program some time ago, and I asked him whether geological surveys had been done in China to see whether there's anywhere to bury the emissions. He simply didn't know the answer. No one seems to know the answers to these really fundamental questions. We don't even seem to know the answers in Australia, or am I wrong about that?
We do know the answers in Australia. Garneau pointed out in his report that Australia was blessed with enormous resources for the burial of CO2.
Near to existing coal-fired
The
power
task is to identify where. Now, in the case of brown coal in Victoria, they're in Bass Strait. Very close. They're in an ideal situation. In the case of the Hunter, we're looking. The New South Wales government is looking, and there are very prospective sites in the Darling Basin and even in the Sydney Basin. But let me just pick up another point that Richard's made. He said we're going to have to scrap existing power stations. Not true. You can retrofit them. Two of the technologies that are being developed, post-combustion capture and oxy-firing, have the strength that they can be put on existing power stations. Now, that's really important for Australia, but it's even more important for China. China has invested billions in building hundreds and hundreds of power stations in the last decade. All those will need to be retrofitted.
Okay.
Now, you ask about looking for storage sites in China. They are looking. We have tried, Australia, the CSIRO and others have tried to help, but of course, digging underground in China has sensitivities, and we haven't been able to provide the help we'd like. But things are going on there.
I'll go back to Richard Dennis, and should there be in this country the same sort of restrictions that the British are now putting on future coal-fired power stations that are going to be built there?
Oh, absolutely, and we should have introduced this quite some time ago, and it should apply to major retrofitting or refitting of power stations. Anyone that wants to refurbish a power station in Australia, anyone that wants to build a new one, from my point of view, let them risk their money. Let them spend their billions of dollars building a coal-fired power station, and if they want to bet that someone's going to invent this technology, more power to them. What the problem we have at the moment is we just keep promising that these things are going to be invented, and then we let people dig us, excuse the pun, deeper and deeper into this hole.
Right.
Until we turn the direction around, we're getting further away from tackling this problem.
We're nearly out of time, but Ralph Hilman, would the industry object or fight a move to do the same thing they've done in Britain, which is to actually, in that case, by 2015, all new coal-fired power stations will have to cut emissions by 25%. By 2025, all of them will have to be 100% emission-free. If the Australian government did that here or tried to, would you fight it?
The Australian government really doesn't have the option, simply because in Britain, of course, they have nuclear, they have gas, they have a range of options.
This is for all new
I think it's highly unlikely that a new coal-fired power station would be built in Australia that wasn't retrofittable or built with carbon capture and storage in mind.
Okay. All right, we'll have to leave you there. Thanks very much, gentlemen. Ralph Hilman and Richard Deniss, thank you very much for joining us.